let's introduce Professor David Hood, who I'm sure you've probably all had a chance to meet anyway. David is a civil and environmental engineer currently working as an adjunct professor in the Science and Engineering faculty at QUT, where he leads the sustainability program of the CRC for infrastructure and engineering asset management. He founded and is immediate past chairman of the Australian Green Infrastructure Council, and in 2010 was elected National Deputy President of Engineers Australia, moving into the role of president in 2012. David was included in the ABC Carbon list of the top 100 sustainability leaders in the world, and amongst the list of Australia's top 100 engineers. This year, David was made a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of his enormous contribution to engineering and for lifting public awareness of sustainability. There's more I could say, as with our past 2 days of keynote speakers, however, I'll leave it there and I'll pass it on to David. Please welcome him to the stage.
Firstly, may I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people, and acknowledge their elders, past and present. I think it's important that we do this, but I'm not really happy with what I see when I look around. Our Indigenous people are representative of a culture and an understanding of nature and land that I think we've sort of discarded, put aside, and to me that's very sad. Engineers Australia actually spent a lot of time developing a reconciliation action plan a couple of years back, and we put it into place last year, my year as president, and it appalled me when I went round and members of Engineers Australia said to me, David, why are we doing this? It's got nothing to do with engineering. So I think we really have to worry about things like that. I didn't know much about ACTS until Delwyn sort of said, why don't you come down and learn about ACTS and be one of our keynote speakers? So I did a bit of research, and I have to say the last couple of days I've been incredibly enthused and impressed. And I see such enthusiasm in the room that I think we can make a difference. And I hope that at the end of my talk, you'll agree. Who was as disappointed as I was yesterday with that panel of our senior university executives? All hands up? It was. It just worries me that that business as usual attitude, when you get to sort of senior levels, pervades management. I think we've really got to drive and work hard to make a change. Hands up those universities that are signatories to the Talwar Declaration. Who knows of the Talwar Declaration? Well, I'd expect most of you in the room, because you're here, would be. But only half of Australia's universities have actually signed it. And most of those that have, the Vice-Chancellors don't even know it. And my Vice-Chancellor, I went in and saw him and I said, have we signed the Talwar's Declaration? He said, I don't know, what's that? On the way out, his PA grabbed me and he said, yes, we have signed it. So there's an example. So we've got a long way to go. Okay, I want to start with a little bit about me and then go into some scary stuff that I hope will scare you, and then in the end sort of talk about how we can get through the problems that we're facing and how attending to the issue of sustainability and climate change particularly is actually good for business. Because if you don't, businesses will just disappear, they'll go out. Does anyone know where that is? Yeah, I know. You be quiet. She's from there. Anyone have a go at it?
Oh, it's definitely Slovenia.
It's where? Bled. It's Bled in Slovenia. And I'd never known where Ljubljana was until the World Engineers Forum was held there. And that's me giving a keynote there. So I want to just start with a little bit about me. The great aha moment, as Al Gore calls it, was when I took over and commissioned that building. That's the building there, not that one there. New Parliament House in Canberra. And I was so appalled with the inefficiency of that building. My prior careers had been big infrastructure. I was a planner and developer in the Air Force and then in civil aviation. In the Air Force, yes, how sustainable is that? But taking over that building, I started to realise that we really have to change the way we design and run our built environment. Just as an example, within the first 18 months of operating that building, we were able to reduce the energy consumption by 40%. The design brief for the building said no new technology, everything had to be proven. Politicians risk averse, you might have noticed. But we really made a big change, and from that point on, that was the mid-80s, I've got deeper and deeper into embedding sustainability in the built environment, which includes green buildings and green infrastructure or sustainable infrastructure, and a big push in trying to change the culture of engineering education. We have what I call the virtuosity model of engineering, where engineers are so wrapped up in the wonderment of their own achievements that they don't really know what those achievements are doing to the planet. So we've really got to change that, and some of that thought and that sort of culture will come through as I'm talking. The next great experience for me was when I bought shares in a company. The company asked me to do a consultancy, asked my firm to look at the technology they had, because the then chairman didn't really understand the black boxes that he'd bought. So I gave a report and went to the board and did the presentation. And the chairman said, David, I've noticed you bought shares in the company because I think I like what I saw. He said, the best way to implement your recommendations would be if you joined the board of the company. So I thought, shit, I wasn't expecting that. So raced home, spoke to my lawyer, got my accountant on the job, and a couple of weeks later I rang back and said, yep, I'll join the board. Went along to my first meeting and they elected me chairman. Well, I wasn't expecting that either. Talk about lying awake at night. It was a publicly listed company. And you know what shareholders are like? They ring you up and say, can you do something to just push the shares up a bit, David? Yeah. Have you ever heard of insider trading? So it was an energy efficiency company. It had black boxes that can reduce the power consumption on rotating machinery. VSDs for fans, things like that. Motor optimizers for instance, lifts. When nobody's on the lift, it doesn't need 240 volts running it. It can run at about 100 volts. So you clip the voltage. As soon as someone steps on, the current rises and the voltage then ramps up to match it. And putting things like that in, you can save 30 and 40% of your electricity. And fluoro saves for fluorescent banks, a whole raft of those sorts of things. So that was a real change, and we did turn the company round from a loss of $44 million when I took over to a first profit 2 years after I was chairman. The other great thing that I am very proud of was founding and getting up and running the Australian Green Infrastructure Council, which is what it was called initially. It's now the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. I was giving a talk on green buildings at Engineers Australia, and a couple of guys came up to me afterwards and said, David, why are buildings having all the fun? What about infrastructure? Why don't we do something like Green Star for infrastructure? So we did a lot of industry talks and workshops, and we set the organisation up, and the chairman now is David Singleton, that guy there, who's the head of Arup's global planning business. And that's another one of the directors. Very successful now. I'm not involved anymore. I stepped off the board when I was elected into Engineers Australia, but they now have $10 billion worth of projects under sustainability assessment in Australia. So that's a great success story. You're going to see more and more in the news about what ISCA is doing. I had the great privilege in 2007 of 3 days with Al Gore. And Delvin, down the corner, stand up Delvin, she was with me. Everyone knows Delvin. She was with me at that great session. And there's Big Al saying, get into those universities, David, and sort them out. Yeah. But for me, there's something far more important. And here she is. That's my granddaughter, 1 week old, looking up at me and saying, Grandpa, is this CO2 thing really serious? Well, she's going to be alive at the end of this century, if everything goes well for her. What sort of a planet are we leaving Cameron? There she is early last year. She's now 4. Move over Angelina Jolie, I say. She's beautiful, but this is what worries me. What sort of a planet are we leaving her? Now, I'm going to set you a little task. A CEO actually said this to me when I was proposing that we embed sustainability in a project. And he said, oh, David, we don't need that sustainability crap in this project because electricity is so cheap here in Australia. And I want you to think about how you would respond if your CEO said that to you. Think university, think something like that. How would you respond? And at the end, I'm going to give a prize for the answers that are closest to what I actually did. Okay, so listen closely to what I'm going to say throughout the talk and think about how you would respond. Now, I want to peek briefly into the future, and it's pretty scary. Some of the things I'm going to say, I want you to really focus on because a lot of people don't focus on these things. There's all sorts of reasons why they don't. What are we facing? Well, it is a pretty serious crisis that we're facing. There are 5 things that I put up there. The climate emergency we hear a lot about. We hear about anthropogenic global warming. We hear about climate change and things like that. But do we really understand what's happening? So the first part of the presentation is going to be going into a little bit of the science around climate change. Now, is there anyone in the room that is not shit scared of the future of us on this planet? For us on this planet? That's good, because if you're not shit scared, and excuse the language, then you don't get the science seriously. Either that, or you're in the pay of the fossil fuel companies, and your level of salary depends on you not understanding the science. Think about that. Next one down is biodiversity loss. Do you realise that we, at the moment, are in the biggest extinction event ever on planet Earth? Geologic records show us previous extinction events. But right now, we are losing species due to our activities at a faster rate than ever before. I was frightened the other day when someone said to me it's about 300 species a day are going extinct. Now that's a horrendous number, but there are probably 1 billion species on the planet, when you count all the insects and the microbes and everything else. 300 a day, because of our activities and what we're doing to the planet, are going extinct. Now those species are all part of a system that keeps us going. It's a holistic system. As we destroy all of those bits and pieces of that system, we start to fall apart. And of course, who's heard of the Club of Rome? Limits to growth, 1972. Yep. We are running out of things. I mean, peak oil, we all heard about it a couple of years ago, but now we've got this mad rush to pull gas out of coal seams and everything, and they say, oh, peak oil's gone because we've got all this unlimited gas down there in coal seam. And that sort of put peak oil off the agenda, but all the elements on the planet are only finite. It's only one planet. And that leads to this next one, the population. What's the population of the planet now? Ian told us on Wednesday, 7 billion people, and by the middle of this century it'll be 10 billion people. How can this planet cope with 10 billion people? I mean, in one sense, that's an incredible challenge for us to make sure that we can provide the food and services, etc. But I think we've reached the limit and that we really have to think about population. Why don't we? Oh, that's a woman's issue. Don't talk about population. We tread on toes. Or it's religion or something. It's taboo, all these taboos, therefore we neglect it. And we just think, oh, it'll work out somehow. And the last one I think we're all familiar with, this cognitive dissonance, that we have belief sets, and when science interrupts our belief set, we then just dismiss the science and stay with our belief. And that's why the deniers get such traction, because I don't think we're wired as humans, as a species, to actually accept the enormity of the problem we're facing. So they're the sort of 5 issues. Now often you hear a lot about one of them and not thinking about them holistically and together. So I'm going to try and get you into that. Now I want to talk a little bit about the science of global warming. From the ice cores down in Antarctica, we can drill down and pull out ice that's up to 800,000 years old. Now when snow falls on Antarctica, it traps little bubbles, and when it freezes, those bubbles become inert, nothing changes. When we drill down into the layers, we can have a look at that bubble. And the easiest thing to find is the concentration of CO2 in the bubble. So there's the plot of CO2 for 800,000 years from bubbles, mostly out of Antarctica, but correlated with ice cores from all around the world. So we know it's an average of the concentration around the world in those years. Now in 800,000 years, it's never been above 300 parts per million. So I'm going to now talk about the next little bit. When you look into the bubble, you can determine different isotopes of oxygen. And the ratio of those isotopes varies depending on the temperature at the time the bubble was frozen. And there's the plot of the temperature from the bubbles. And a little girl looked up at Al Gore and said, don't they fit together? Pretty much do fit together. But if you look very closely at the expanded area, sometimes the temperature rises first. And therefore the deniers of the science will immediately grab that little and cherry pick that little bit and say, therefore temperature rose first, it's got nothing to do with CO2. Well, who's heard of the Milankovitch cycle? One person, 2, maybe 3. The Milankovitch cycle is actually the Earth's orbit around the sun, which is an ellipse normally, but it comes in to be a circle and then moves out to be an ellipse over about 150,000 year cycle. If you look very closely there, you'll see it's about 150,000 between the dips here. Also, the axis of the Earth wobbles a little bit and it precesses and so on, and those things all combine to actually cause the radiation landing on the planet to increase in about 150,000 year cycle. So when that increases, the temperature does go up, of course. And when the temperature goes up and warms the planet, we get a lot of growth happening. We get more CO2 then released, and once the CO2 starts to build in the atmosphere, away goes the temperature. The science behind what's called radiative forcing is easily understood. Does anyone not understand radiative forcing? Greenhouse gas, the effect of greenhouse gases. It's not an insulating blanket or anything like that. The sun's rays come from the sun in high frequency. They're in the light, ultraviolet, etc. Some infrared because you do feel warm in the sun. But it passes through the atmosphere pretty much unchanged. It doesn't interact with the molecules in the atmosphere. And that energy is absorbed by the planet and warms the planet. Now, any body radiates infrared once it warms up. So the infrared radiation coming out of the planet and through the atmosphere is what is causing the problem with greenhouse gases. The molecule of CO2 gets excited when infrared radiation hits it. The atoms jump out into, the electrons jump out into a higher orbit. It vibrates. What's a vibrating molecule in anything? Heat, from your physics. So the atmosphere is warming as this infrared radiation goes out. But then the molecule drops back to its normal state. And what happens when it drops back? We all know. A pulse of radiation leaves the molecule. A pulse of infrared radiation. Where does half that radiation go? Out to space. Where does the other half go? Back to Earth. That's the radiative forcing. Increase the greenhouse gases, what happens? Increases the amount of infrared coming back to the Earth. That's well understood science. You can't deny it. You can't argue with science. And yet we have a whole lot of people that try to. So where are we today? Well, this is from Al Gore, where he got up on that large extension and he kept going up and up and up and up. It's pretty scary. We're way, way above the 300. In fact, early this year, we actually hit the 400 parts per million. For the first time in 3 million years, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere went over 400 parts per million. Now, what we don't know, of course, is what's going to happen just here. In the past, it's run pretty much parallel. We're now up here. What's going to happen to the temperature? So we're going to talk a little bit about temperature. A lot of the deniers will say, oh, well, how do we know it's due to burning fossil fuels? Well, there are human fingerprints all over it. What we can see is that the carbon in the atmosphere from those bubbles is carbon-14. That's not derived from burning coal. When you burn coal, you put carbon-12 and 13 in the atmosphere. So by just looking at the CO2 in the atmosphere now, you can easily determine that it's human-caused. So I really worry about the deniers and how they get such traction. Let's just look at it. There's the plot of what's happening to temperature, land surface temperature, and I stress that. Land surface temperature has been rising inexorably. There's the long-term average, the red line. But what do deniers think about it? Well, they look at it and they say, okay, look at this bit here. It's cooling. Yeah, it did for a few years. Then they go very quiet for a while. Then they say, hey, look, it's still cooling. Go very quiet again, still cooling, still cooling, still cooling, and today they're saying it is still cooling. Was that cooling? In fact, recently they're starting to talk about long term, and you hear the terms, it's been cooling for 15 years. Well, the land surface temperature has been static for 15 years, but we are not cooling. I mean, I could have done that and said it's actually heating up a lot more than you guys think. So be very cautious of deniers. So where's all this heat going at the moment? Well, there's the static bit on land and atmosphere, but what's going into the ocean? Is the planet cooling? Now, that's well understood from oceanographic studies of temperature of the ocean. Pretty serious stuff. Now, my favourite profession, the engineers ring me up and they say, David, 2 degrees increase? Oh, God, that's nothing. We have 30-degree changes, in a year. And even on the day, we can get a 25-degree shift in temperature. Doesn't affect us. What they're neglecting, of course, is the distribution of climate. And it's climate. It's not weather. It's climate we've got to think about. And we have these really cold days and these stinking hot days. Now, it was in here that Victoria's rail system shut down 2 years ago when the temperature got into 43, 44 degrees. Transformers all switched off because they couldn't cool themselves. And the whole of Victoria ground to a halt. With a 2-degree shift in the average, the whole distribution moves. We might, and I don't think this is going to happen, we might lose some of those freezing cold days. But look what happens at this end. We go into an area that we've never known before. Never had those temperatures on this planet before. That is pretty seriously. And what we hate now is going to increase by about 26%. And I've got a little NASA-derived plot of the anomalies of temperature from 1950 to 2011. Now you can see how the anomalies are varying. There was a little bit of cooling for a while there, 70s, before the 70s. Now here it goes. This is the more recent times. Look at this big bubble of increased heat that's occurring. Now the important thing of this is the distribution. We're still getting those cold days. The variability is actually increasing in our climate. But what we're getting are these horrendous hot periods here. And how's our buildings and our infrastructure going to cope with it? And Al Gore said, the news that some stations have measured concentrations over 400 parts per million in the atmosphere is further evidence that the world's political leaders, with the honourable exception of a few, are failing catastrophically to address the climate crisis. History and my granddaughter will not understand or forgive them. And he said that in July last year. It amazes me that we have 97% of the world's climatologists, those people with the competency and expertise to understand and know, are all saying it is serious and it is happening and it is human-caused. Only 3% are not violently disagreeing, they're still questioning, and that's what skeptics are all about. So the 3% are the true skeptics in science. But 97% all agree. And importantly, every National Academy of Science in the world has signed off and said, no longer debating it, it's happening. And yet we still have these deniers saying it's not happening. Now, even these great left-wing hippie organisations, the World Bank, are saying 4 degrees and urging people to turn down the heat. Another hippie organisation, PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the biggest accounting firms in the world, has said it's too late for 2 degrees, saying again, we're headed for 4 degrees. Business, wake up. How are you going to cope with it? So we have to do something. Now, this was something that was put out by the IPCC, you know, that bunch of ratbag scientists who are making a lot of money out of grants from the government to keep giving the government what it wants. Yeah, likely. Have you ever seen any scientist as rich as Clive Palmer? Right. No. This was showing that if we get a 4-degree increase average globally, the distribution of temperatures will be something like this around the planet. And you can see what's happening up in the Arctic. That red up there is a 20-degree shift upwards. And that's what's causing the Arctic to melt so rapidly. And even you look here in Australia and you say, yeah, that's nice and cool, it's green and yellow. But hey guys, Sydney is about a 6-degree average increase if we get only a 4-degree increase globally. So I think we have to worry. The other great disturbing thing is last summer in the Arctic, the ice loss hit a world record ever in ice loss there. But of course this year, it's crept back a bit and the deniers are saying, see, full recovery, nothing's happening. Just 1 year. Cherry pick 1 year and say it's not happening. Actually, when you measure the thickness of the ice that has grown back this summer in the Arctic, the mass of ice is less, far less. So we're still losing ice up there at an incredible rate. Now, of course, when that melts, you don't get sea level rise. You all do the glass thing with the ice in it, and as the ice melts, it doesn't pour out over the edge, does it? And I get engineers again ringing me up and saying, David, this sea level rise is a load of rubbish. You know, where's all this water coming from? Well, it's pretty easy to look at this little island here, Greenland. Does anyone know how thick the ice on Greenland is? It's out of water, fresh water, ice out of the sea. It's 3 kilometres deep on average. It's so heavy that the land of Greenland is depressed by 2 metres. It is such a gravitational attraction that the sea is rising towards Greenland. And it is melting, and it is melting fast. It's frightening what's happening. If it all melts, it'll give us a 7-metre sea level rise around the globe, average around the globe. 7 metres. The sums are easy. We know the area, we know 3 kilometres thick, 70% of it is covered in ice. You can work out the volume of ice. If it melts, that goes into the sea. You know the surface area of oceans, you can work it out. And it's about 11.6 metres until you sort of allow for the inundation on land. And it comes out at an average of about 7. And it's actually moving horrendously. This is last year in July. The normal summer melt is around the edges. Last year, the entire ice block started to melt on the surface. Not totally, but on the surface. And of course, when that happens, what does this look like? You see a difference between that. And the energy coming from the sun, what's going to happen? Dark objects absorb more energy than white objects. So you get a positive feedback. And that starts to melt even faster. And the other horrible thing is that as it melts, it finds its way down cracks. The water then goes down to the bottom through the ice, and it's starting to lubricate the rock ice surface. And we're now having ice moving at a rate that ice earthquakes on Greenland have increased by 500% in the last 10 years. So what scientists are worried about is that there could be a massive tipping point when large blocks of ice are going to flop off into the ocean. And we're already seeing some of that start. It's pretty scary stuff. And there's the special committee to investigate the climate change hysteria will now come to order in the capital of the United States of America. Bit of a worry. There's Brisbane Airport with 1 metre sea level rise. You can't operate aircraft on that. And that's only 1 metre sea level rise. The Hadley Centre in the UK has advised last year that we could see on the east coast of Australia 2 metre sea level rise by the end of this century. 2 metres. This is a nice picture of the Lincoln Memorial there, and with 4 metres, it will look like that. And there's Melbourne with 7 metre sea level rise. Of course, my mates in Brisbane say, who cares about that? Okay, this is not sea level rise. As the atmosphere warms, it can hold a hell of a lot more moisture. Any warm atmosphere will hold more moisture. As it gets more energy and more moisture, you're going to get more severe weather events. And this was 2 years ago in Rockhampton. There's the airport. That piece of infrastructure was not designed to take that sort of weather event. And it happens all over Queensland. I think it was about 75% of the whole of Queensland was underwater. It was a catastrophe. And the cost of the repairs that we had to do to roads out west comes into something like $2.1 billion of repairs. And yet, what's happening with that money? It's all deferred, it's done, it's repaired on debt, it's pushed out to the future. Someone else is going to pay for it. And therefore, we're not scaring us at the moment. I'll come to that again. There's Germany last year. June this year. Look at it. Biggest floods in Europe that they've ever seen. We're familiar with them, but Europe's not quite as familiar. So I'm going to now move into what do we need to change? What are the things that we've got to think about in terms of shifting our psyche? The Club of Rome in 1972, it was a bunch of businessmen, scientists, politicians got together and they started modelling the planet under the current business paradigms. And what they said is that, of course, it's one planet. We are taking things from it so fast that we just won't be able to continue. And they said that by about 40 years, we'll run out of things on the planet if we keep going with the current economic model. So can we keep going? I like this little plot. This was from the Club of Rome's work. This is humans living and their economic activity. You can see it rising. This is the capacity of the planet to keep things going. Now, I believe we're about here. We've passed the capacity of the planet to repair itself and provide the services that we need. And what Paul Gilding says is that we're headed for a great disruption, a collapse. Who's read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse? Yeah. Well, we're headed for a collapse. We can do some things that will stop that, but our leaders are not even aware that there's a problem. Paul is a great guy. Read his book, The Great Disruption. And I love the byline that he put on it in the US. Why the climate crisis will bring on the end of shopping and the birth of a new world. That's the Australian book. This is the US book. And that's Paul. He used to be the world CEO of Greenpeace. It's an interesting story because he wanted to move Greenpeace out of activism and into the boardrooms to explain to businessmen that we're headed for a crisis. And the Greenpeace activists said, no, we want to stay chasing whaling boats. And so he resigned and he set up his own consultancy, and he now consults with big business, trying to urge them to make change. I love Albert Einstein's quotes. You've probably seen this. You cannot solve a problem using the same mindset that created the problem. So we have to start thinking about change. And I thank Ian Lowe for this picture. He loves it. This is what he calls the pig view of the economy, where the economy is this and society and nature are the ears on the pig. And of course, the pig is smiling because only 2% of the world's population own and control 98% of the world's wealth. We're the other 98% that doesn't own or control that 98% of the world's wealth. What we should be thinking about is something like this. We should recognize that nature, this thing here, is holistic and total. Society sits within it, and the economy is something that we've constructed, so don't let it rule us totally. Now, the great thing I worry about is that politicians are hung up on this thing called GDP. They want GDP to be growing all the time at sort of 3%, 4% would be better. If we can get to 5%, that'd be really great. But what does GDP count? It measures how fast we take stuff out of the earth, move it through the economy, and dump it in landfill. So if you speed that process up, GDP goes up, because it measures flow through the economy. It measures silly things like the cost of security, the cost of police, the cost of pollution cleanup, crash repairs, emergency treatment, health costs. Are they positive things? Yet they all add to GDP. So guys, I want you to go out and crash your cars, please. GDP will go up. All of you get sick, please, because we need more hospitals, GDP will go up. I want you all to rob each other. Go and steal and pickpocket, because we need more police, GDP will go up. Can you see the sense in that? What it doesn't measure are these things. It doesn't measure happiness. It doesn't measure how much love there is in this room here, amongst us all. It doesn't measure all the work that I contribute to the Australian Green Infrastructure Council, unpaid, to Engineers Australia, unpaid. That's not measured. But to my mind, it's all adding to the value of our society. It doesn't measure feeling secure and being well. The 40% that I saved in New Parliament House was not measured as an improvement in GDP. It just doesn't count. It doesn't measure our standard of living. If you improve all the DIY stuff you do in your home to increase the value of that home for you, is not counted in GDP. And of course, it doesn't measure the bubbles that occur up and down. So we need to change GDP. We need another measure for wellness in society. And there's a lot of work going on around the world that is actually looking at that, and particularly coming out of Bhutan and places like Colombia, where they really know how to connect with nature. The other thing that I worry about is in the construction industry, infrastructure industry, is this thing called benefit-cost ratio. If you make the benefit-cost ratio greater than 1, the project can go ahead. Now, I want you to look at cost. Easily to be attributed. Once you've got your scope, you can pull out Cordell's price book and you can get the price of it. Okay, that's easy to fix. But you leave out the externalities. Don't cost all the carbon you put into the atmosphere. Don't cost all the damage you do to the land and the species, etc. And how do you really measure the benefits? This is the fuzzy one. So you can put all sorts of values on benefit if you want your project to get up. And then other ones say, oh, no, you can't take the value down on that because it's not real. And therefore the project won't go ahead. And they use this thing called NPV. You know, costs occur now, so they're today's, these are all later. And they use net present value to discount the later things back to today's price. So improvements in the environment in the future are brought back to almost zero today. So it's a silly measure. Future benefits have less value than today's costs. You know, if we build highways and people get killed on the roads in 20 years' time, you bring back that death to today's value, it's almost worthless. So let's build the road. You know. But we can do things. I pulled out the balanced scorecard system in a management book, and I looked at it and said, how can we embed sustainability in the business psyche? Well, if you look at the things in the balanced scorecard, there's things like set your objectives, set some targets as you go around each of the processes. And you can embed sustainability in all of those processes. And I'll show you how you can actually look at the drivers to a value in a company and build it. And this is the result of work that we did at the CRC for Infrastructure and Engineering Asset Management. We surveyed companies to try and find out
how they were embedding sustainability and how their CEOs saw it. And this is why I didn't get any excitement out of the bunch here yesterday in terms of CEOs and how they would measure sustainability. But on the right-hand side here, we've got the potential impact of putting sustainability into all of these sort of levers, if you like. These are the levers that drive a company in terms of eventual shareholder value. And so you can look at all the things like in market share. If you enhance the reputation through customer loyalty by people saying that company's doing really good things, then you will put a lever into the market share or the new market entry or your risk premiums. And these two down here are probably the most important in terms of what shareholders see when they look into a company. Are you managing the risks in your company properly? Are you managing the environment? Are you looking after society? Who's heard of that classic thing that companies use when they go in to build a huge, massive project through a town? It's called frogs, jobs and swimming pools. So what does the company do? They find a frog somewhere. Oh, look, we're saving the environment. We're going to rehabilitate this little frog. Jobs, we're going to create enormous jobs for your society. We're going to increase the jobs. You're still not happy? Well, we'll give you a health centre or a swimming pool. That's what happens. And we're not yet measuring societal impact properly on our big projects. But what this showed us, and there's a book that you can get through EA Books, and I'll show you in a minute, it showed that if you attend to all of these, each of these has an improvement going through to profit, cash flow, and a multiplier from these brand strength things that eventually increases share price. Now, the problem with CEOs at the moment is it's not immediate. Most of them are talking about today's reporting or the next year's annual report or something like that. And shareholders tend to be a little bit demanding of immediate returns. We have to think a bit differently. This measure we did also showed us that back in 1982, the value that shareholders put on a company was about 62% on the tangible assets. That's all the hard things, the buildings, the plant, all the sort of stuff that's easy to measure and put a cost on. And only 38% on the sort of things like brand strength and whether they had the good CSR, etc. Well, today it's changed around completely. Today it's only 23% on the tangibles and 77% on these intangibles, and that's where sustainability sits, in the intangibles. So if a company improves its sustainability focus, it will improve its share value. I just want to touch on how projects sort of, where we sit at the moment, and this is a little plot. This is sustainability impact, doing things for the environment in a positive sense, doing things for society in a positive sense. This is losing money, this is making money. Now, nobody wants to work here where you actually destroy the environment and lose money. Up in here, you find that governments will spend your taxpayers doing the right thing, but they don't expect a return. So it's your money works in the good zone, but loss-making. Where are we today in the sort of way we look at projects? Well, we tend to work here, where we minimise the impact on the environment and we maximise the profit we make. So we're still minimising. And things like Green Star and other measures and things like that are really saying to us, if you do good things and get 6 Green Star, then you're doing a good thing for the environment, but it's still negatively impacting. So you find that the CEOs will say, let's do another 6-star Green Star building. We're doing a great thing. We're improving the environment and so on. But actually, you're still degrading it. Where should we be? We should be up here, working where we actually net positive improvements to the environment and society, but still making money. And you can do it. And what I want to show is the book that we actually produced. This is something I really, in that business book that I looked at, I found this thing saying, when you do all these things right, you get sustainable results. Now, of course, what they meant is that your company keeps making profit. It sustains profit. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to think about is sustainability outcomes rather than sustainable results. There's the book. It's available through EA Books. It sells for $50 for the hard copy and $20 for the e-copy download. Why infrastructure sustainability is good for your business. It's not just infrastructure. You can apply it to any proposal or project that you're doing. Who's heard of MAC curves? Marginal abatement cost curves. To my mind, these are the things that you can take into your board and your chairman and really sell a project, because what it shows, this is for a fixed period, say up to 2030. You then work out the cost of doing something and the return of abatement, greenhouse gas abatement, and these are all returns in the 30 years that you make money on, and in 30 years, this is where you lose money. And so you can easily say, well, if we can improve the company's income by all of that coming back to the company, Surely we can do some of these too and go out to a balance point. Now that's the US, so that's a national level. You can do it at a company level. And the great one that I love was the UK Post. They decided to look at the curved things on the front of all their vans, you know, those aerofoils. And they did a marginal abatement curve on that particular one, and guess what the payback period was? 5 minutes. When every truck left the yards, they saved petrol immediately because of the aerodynamic characteristics. And you can do it on a project level. You can look at your projects and analyse everything on the project. Great things you should be using. I just want to touch on what it takes to get action. There's 4 things that you need. You need a threat. Well, I think we have a threat. I think it's clearly enunciated that we've got a threat. It has to be immediate, impacting now, or its impacts have to be clearly defined, understood, accepted, and frightening. Well, we don't see the impacts now immediately, except when Sandy hit the east coast of the US and Katrina hit New Orleans, etc. And there must be unacceptable cost. And of course you need leadership. Now you can look at UK during World War II. They had the threat from Germany. Bombs were landing. They started to put in costs on everybody. You had, what are those things called? You got the what? Coupons. You had to get rationed. That's the word I was looking for. And then there must be leadership. Well, Winston Churchill stood up and sort of saved the day there with his rhetorical speeches, etc. Now, I think we've got all those. We must change the way we communicate if we're to have any success. Instead of economic growth, let's start talking about national well-being. Last year I got Engineers Australia. Every press release that went out, I took out economic growth and put national well-being in it. Engineers contribute to national well-being, not just economic growth. Start talking about sustainable, or now we say sustainable business. Instead, we should be saying business delivering sustainability outcomes. That's the important thing we've got to start saying. Stop using cost benefit, I've explained that. And at least bring in all the externalities if you have to use this sort of thing. And I want you to think about 2 new terms: sustainability, the ability to sustain what we want, and sustainments. What are the sustainments that we need to create? And we can do these things. There's the solar thermals in Spain. They're fantastic. If we did that in Australia, we could get off coal in 10 years. There's wind farms, and there's some terrific community wind farms going up around Australia now. Now back to this question. How would you respond? I want responses. What would you do if your CEO said that to you? And I'm going to give 2 prizes for those that get closest to what I actually did. This is a terrific kids' book. It's called Engie Bear's Dream. It's blatantly promoting engineering, of course, because we need more engineers in this country. There's no doubt about that. What would you do?
I'd say, but what if it takes $1 million over the next 5 to 10 years?
He's the CEO and he's already made up his mind. He's probably not going to listen to that. Sorry. You what?
I'd say your point being.
Your point being, I'm making money for my shareholders. Yep.
After listening to you, I think you considered your options and left the organisation.
You've got the prize. I resigned, and I'll give the second one to you, your point being, yeah. So you really have to. I mean, it's far better to resign on a principle than be sacked on a principle. Just think of that. Yeah. So the takeouts for you, what I want you to think about very seriously. The first one, leave here today with a better understanding of this crisis. Know that it's happening. Persuade people. Talk over the back fence, barbecues, wherever. Tell people how serious it is. But tell people we can make a difference and we can change it. Work damn hard on your VCs to get them to stand up, as I said yesterday, and be the university that's going to shine in this area. And I think that would make a real difference. Get the bloody VC to set some big, hairy, audacious goals. Better integrate FM from your universities into the faculties. You know, around our faculties, we've got some of the leading architects and engineers in this area. Why aren't they working with the FM department to really make a difference? If the VC sets those hairy, audacious goals, then the FMs will have to follow and they'll call in the best architects, engineers, social workers, etc. Integrate sustainability into all disciplines being taught. Don't have it as a subject in first year only and then just forget it for the rest of the 3 years of engineering, 4 years of engineering. And develop and disseminate sustainability resources. We don't have enough resources in this area. That book that's on my desk there, about sustainability for teachers is a magic book. Get hold of those sorts of resources. Thanks, there it is. So we can do this. For God's sake, we put Curiosity on Mars, a fantastic thing. And I got really angry when papers said what a great feat of science it was. And I had to write to the editor and say, excuse me, that wasn't science, it was engineering, based on science, but it was engineering. Thank you very much.